Sup guys, Bjorn here. I hope you're all doing great. Today we're diving into some murky 9.2 waters with the 9.2 DPS Mythic Plus tier list. It's gonna be a ton of fun. These are my predictions, my opinions, keep that in mind, so take it with a grain of salt. I also have a few more caveats before we go into the video, because this is all based on PTR stuff, right? So this is bound to change, tuning hasn't happened yet, there's a bunch of bug tier sets, bug legendaries, etc. I will get into the more specifics on each spec if we find it necessary to delve into that. Then I also just have to say that if your spec ends up in B tier, C tier, or maybe even D tier, all things considered, I think you're going to be quite fine in 9.2. The balance is very close, all specs are capable of doing good damage in Mythic Plus, and every spec brings some unique utility. So even if you're in D tier, you're not going to be useless in Mythic Plus, and you're going to be very capable of completing Mythic Plus 15, Mythic Plus 20 if you want to do it, and even higher of course. Now, the third thing I want to say is just that the class balance here depends a lot on what dungeon you're running, what kind of affixes there are, and what comp you have, and what kinds of pulls you're doing, obviously. So there's a lot to take into account here. This is supposed to be a very general tier list. Something you've probably also noticed is this key here on the left side, and I just quickly wanted to go through it before we get started, because there's one crucial thing that is introduced in 9.2 Mythic Plus that we've never ever seen before, and that is the 9.2 tier sets. The fact that we're getting tier sets in 9.2 Mythic Plus actually creates quite an interesting situation when it comes to the meta, because first of all, not all tier sets are actually created equal, right? You could have your tier set be amazing AoE damage in Mythic Plus, or it could just be a small buff to single target that doesn't really do anything in there. So not only do we have a situation where class balances might be skewed quite a bit, but we also have a situation where, since some specs are going to be real strong with their tier set acquired, while some specs might be comparatively really strong without their tier set and then only gain a small amount when they equip their tier set, this creates a very weird situation where balance is going to shift wildly over the course of the patch as people are gaining their tier set, right? I'm going to try to represent this in my tier list with these three different color codes here. So if your spec has a green circle, it means that you have a very low reliance on your tier set and board power in 9.2. This should mean that you're very strong comparatively at the start of the patch, and then you're gonna fall off. If you have a red circle, it means the opposite, right? You have a very high reliance on your tier set to do damage, and this means that once you get your board power, you will start performing adequately, but before then you might be very, very bad compared to the other classes. And then we have the yellow circle, that just means somewhere in the middle, right? You might have a medium reliance on your tier set in order to do damage, you might be pretty mediocre without it, but then gain a decent amount, you might be real strong without it, and then still gain a decent amount, right? This doesn't really tell us anything about the spec balance, it only tells us if they're gonna fall off or not as the patch continues. Okay guys, you've waited long enough, let's get straight into the tier list. And we're starting off with Mage, because it's Blizzard's favorite class, so why not, right? First we have Fire. Fire is in a pretty similar position to 9.1, I would say. It isn't amazing, but it's definitely a pretty good Mythic Plus spec. Just the fact that it is a mage on its own carries a huge amount of value, right? You have the Arcane Intellect, you have the Lust, you have a range spec with very good damage profile, very strong AoE, you can go Night Fae, and you have a decent synergy with your tier set and your double legendary as well. The problem is that the tier set isn't really that great, and it also got nerfed by 50%. And when you compare it to the other casters of 9.2, and especially the other mage specs, it starts to fall short a little. Now, if you want to play Fire in 9.2, I think you're going to be completely fine. It's definitely a good spec, and you're going to have a ton of fun on it, but I don't think it's going to be quite as optimal as the other two. Next up we have Frost Mage, and this is quite possibly the most broken spec in 9.2. It's insta S tier, incredibly strong, and the reasons are just so many. First of all, we have very, very good AoE damage, very good profile with constant CDs up, constant damage. We have some of the best funneling in the game. We have mage utility, lust, all that good stuff, of course. We have incredibly good mob control with these slows and the roots and stuff like that. We have good synergy with the seasonal affix, in that you get a lot of CDR on your frozen orbs, on your mage covenant ability. The spec isn't really that reliant on your tier set or your board powers, but you also gain quite a bit of damage from the tier set and from the double legendary, so they are by no means bad, and you're gonna scale very well in the patch as well. I think there's just a ton of things speaking for the Frost Mage right now. I think it's quite possibly the best spec in 9.2. On to Arcane Mage. I think this lands in the A tier. It's a very strong spec in 9.2, gains a lot of damage from the 4-piece and the double legendary. However, the damage profile maybe isn't quite as good as Frost or Fire. You're also losing all of that slow utility from Frost Mage, so it's probably not going to be brought a huge ton above Frost Mage because Frost Mage is just that strong. It might see some play because of its great burst windows. It might see some really strong numbers in 9.2 as well if players start stacking things on top of each other with a 4-piece with a double legendary. Ton of fun to play as well, but when you compare it to the Frost Mage, I'm gonna have to say it falls quite short, considering it's a lot more difficult to play with a lot less upsides. Next up we have one of the biggest disappointments of 9.2 I think, in the Affliction Warlock. It goes in the C tier, mainly just because of how bad the tier set and the double legendary is for the spec in Mythic Plus. The tier set doesn't really synergize with the AoE build whatsoever. You would want to play Sow the Seeds on Affliction, on AoE weeks at least. Now you can't do that whatsoever. You have to play some Malefic Rapture build that just doesn't do that much damage, sadly. The upside here though is that since your baseline with Sow the Seeds is actually pretty strong, you can roll into the patch in those first few weeks and be fairly efficient in Mythic Plus without worrying about the tier set or the double legendary. But once you get the board power, you're gonna fall off a cliff. Ironically, I think Destro is kind of what Affliction is meant to be, or at least what it was in 9.1, because Destro in 9.2 here has a very, very strong AoE profile, which makes it one of the best casters in Mythic Plus in 9.2, I think. It has some really, really strong uncapped AoE with a 4-piece, spawning an extra Infernal after you cast an X amount of Rains. Since you're already spamming Rains with Reign of Chaos in Mythic Plus, this actually has incredible synergy with the build you're already running, and Destruction Warlock already had some of the best uncapped AoE in the game in 9.1. This is only gonna get better in 9.2, and once you get the 4-piece, once you get the double legendary, you're gonna start blasting. Now, however, I think that you're quite reliant on that 4-piece to do damage, because in a normal key, when you're just running from pack to pack, small pulls, destruction isn't really that great, and the single target damage in 9.2 is also quite subpar. This means that Destro isn't really a spec you would just bring to any key. You would probably more want it in the heavy AoE focused dungeons with the heavy AoE focused affixes. That said, I definitely think that with Reign of Chaos, with Wilfred's, you're gonna be quite effective in any key as destruction in 9.2, and it might very well be the best Warlock spec, hands down. Moving on to Demo, a spec that I quite enjoy myself, and I think is actually quite underrated in Mythic Plus. Now, everyone's gonna say that their main is underrated, obviously, so I take that with a grain of salt, but especially in 9.2, I think the Demo look is actually looking quite good because of the tier set. So the 2-piece actually adds quite a lot to your passive AoE damage with the Dogs build, and your 4-piece adds an extra layer of passive AoE damage to the implosions. This means that your overall AoE output with the tier set actually goes up quite a bit, and the double legendary is also real strong for demonology. So all in all, once you get your board power in 9.2, I think you're going to be blasting quite a lot actually. The downside of Demo in 9.2 is probably still going to be the damage profile, because even though you can diversify a little bit, switching out of the 1-minute Tyrant, going for more dog damage, more AoE focused builds, you're still on that single target focused talent build with some cleave AoE. That's quite strong cleave AoE definitely, but it isn't anything that can rival any of these casters up in the S and the A tier when it comes to just consistency and burst, right? You're mostly reliant on your dogs to proc. Next up we have the Warrior. I think both specs are looking pretty strong in 9.2. Arms might be just a little bit on the weaker side because of the scaling, right? It doesn't scale quite as well with gear as Fury does, and the tier set is also maybe a little bit worse, I would say. Arms does have a strong damage profile in Mythic Plus, good decent single target damage, good burst AoE, good consistent AoE, but I just don't think that it will have quite the same numbers as Fury when it comes to a little bit later into the patch. I think Fury can actually be quite a menace when it comes to late game 9.2 here. It's going to be one of the strongest melee specs for sure at the end of the patch. You're going to become really tanky as well. You're going to do a ton of damage on both single target and cleave, and it's probably going to be one of the more fun specs to play, especially at the maybe 15 to 20 level. The tier set reliance here on Fury is quite high compared to Arms, I would say, but still both of them are completely fine without tier set, and both of them are very good with the tier set. Okay, we've arrived at the Rogue here, which is quite a difficult spec to rank usually because of their lower damage but higher utility, which means that you kind of want to bring one rogue, you don't really want to bring more rogues, and if one of the rogue specs are good, then that is usually incredibly good while the other two are bad. And this patch, Subtlety is incredibly good. It's a very, very strong spec, probably top 2 along with Frost Mage. The damage is good, both on single target and on AoE, even though it's obviously going to be quite a bit lower compared to these other specs up here when it comes to AoE. That said, you're bringing all that necessary rogue utility, you have great funnel, you have a good tier set, you have good border power, even though the tier set recently got just a little nerf. When it comes to high-end play, I think similar to the Frost Mage, sub-rogue is going to be brought to pretty much every single dungeon. It's just that good. It isn't incredibly reliant on the tier set, but it does see a substantial gain in both AoE and single target from the 2-piece and the 4-piece, and the Legendary isn't bad either. Sadly, things aren't looking as great for the other two rogue specs, because they just don't do that much damage, and it's a combination of bad base damage, some Mythic Plus problems, but also just their tier sets and their board power being kind of sad in 9.2. Assassination gets some decent help on AoE from their tier set, but they still have some re-stealth issues, they don't do that much damage to begin with, and although their single target is quite decent, it isn't really merited to bring them for any reason, when you could bring sub, when you could bring outlaw, or you could just bring a spec that actually does damage throughout the entire dungeon on both AoE and single target. That said, I'm still sure that you can succeed as an assassination rogue in 9.2. Once you do get the tier set, you do have some nice AoE value there from the poison and bleed AoE. However, I still think you're going to be much better off playing another rogue spec. Outlaw actually quite recently saw a massive buff to their tier set, but it's still quite underwhelming in AoE especially, and I don't think that Outlaw is going to be a good spec in 9.2 Mythic Plus. It suffers from a lot of the same issues as Assassination, right? We have low damage, not really any reason to bring it over sub when sub does more damage on single target, more damage on AoE, and has the same utility. Next up, Marksmanship Hunter. This is a spec that's currently very strong in 9.1, and it's gonna continue to be very strong in 9.2 as well. You're retaining everything you're doing currently with the good cleave damage, the good AoE damage, you have all of the good hunter utility obviously, very easy to play, range spec, etc, etc. You're also gaining quite a few fun things actually, because your tier set is really strong on AoE, and it actually also enables a new legendary for you to run, which means that you will have more focus on trick shots. Your 2 target will also be a lot better than it is currently, which is actually quite a big boon for the Marksmanship Hunter. So all in all, 9.2 looking like a very strong patch. The same cannot really be said for Beast Mastery, however, because the spec is mostly single target focused right now, the tier set doesn't really add that much either, and you're gonna struggle when it comes to the overall damage in the dungeons here. The spec is obviously still pretty simple to play, you're gonna perform fine on this spec in most dungeons, but in terms of just overall value compared to these other specs, you're probably gonna lag behind quite a bit. If you're a Beast Mastery main, don't worry too much, you're definitely gonna be able to outperform most of these other specs in C and B tier if you're running dungeons frequently. You're also gonna be really strong in single target in 9.2, so you might see some play in raid here, but overall I think it's one of the weaker dungeon specs in 9.2. We finally arrived, Survival Hunter, and if you want to see me rate Survival Hunter in 9.2, I think you should help me survive here on YouTube by subscribing down below, guys. It would help me out a ton. Thanks a lot. If you haven't heard about it, the Survival Hunter is looking incredibly strong on 9.2, and it's mainly because of its tier set. The AoE damage from this thing is just incredible. It's gonna be probably the highest overall damage in pretty much every single dungeon, if you're not doing some crazy MDI style pulls with the uncapped caster classes maybe. But in your just average 15s, 20s, Survival Hunter is gonna be an absolute blaster. That said, there are a huge amount of question marks actually plaguing the Survival Hunter going into 9.2 still, because we have all of the uncertainty with the damage and the tier set and whatnot, but we also have some survivability issues that has been plaguing the class for a long time, ironically enough. Since you're both a melee spec and you don't really have that survivability, you're gonna be struggling a lot in higher keys, and you might actually end up having to go like Necrolord or something in order to gain some extra survivability there. There's also just a possibility that Blizzard nerfs the tier set to the extent that the damage isn't really worth taking, because remember, the only reason that survival is an S tier here is because it does a ton of damage, right? If it didn't do any damage, it would just always be worse than Marksmanship, because Marksmanship has the same utility, but it's a range spec, so survival really only rides on its huge damage here, which means that it's probably the spec in this entire list that it's the most suspect to changes. If Blizzard makes any balance tuning, it's very likely that the spec gets shifted. Another thing to note about survival is that it's quite reliant on its tier set. The damage without the tier set isn't bad in AoE in 9.1, but when you consider just how much damage that tier set adds on top, you still have to consider the Survival Hunter very reliant on the tier set. This means that for the first weeks of the patch, before you get that tier set, you're very likely not an S tier spec at all, you're probably very mediocre somewhere down here, which means that you might actually struggle a little bit at the start of the patch as the Survival Hunter. Moving on to the Druid, and here we're starting off with Balance, a spec that has historically been incredibly broken in Mythic Plus because it just has a really good amount of utility that pretty much no other class brings. I think that 9.2, however, will finally bring an end to the Balance dominance. There are a couple of different reasons for this. First of all, I think that some other specs have become more powerful, right? Frost Mage, Sub Rogue, and Survival are all really strong specs that you would want to bring maybe over a Balanced Druid, even if that Balanced Druid has some utility. Secondly, the tier set of the Balanced Druid isn't really that great on AoE at all, so you're mainly bringing the Balanced Druid for its single target damage. Furthermore, Curian Balanced was actually recently nerfed on the PTR quite substantially, which means that if you were to bring the Balanced Druid as a buff spec, it also loses even more value now. This means that I think the best balance build will be Venthyr Balanced Druid as a single target bot. Basically, you're bringing it to the dungeons for some really strong single target damage, maybe on tyrannical weeks. Its uncapped AoE and its burst AoE is still not bad, it just isn't really that buffed by the tier set, which means that it might comparatively lose some value when you get later into the patch. However, the Balanced Druid tier set is still very strong on single targets, still works very well with Venthyr, and the Venthyr double legendary is incredibly good for balance. So all in all, the board power isn't bad for balance, it's just not that good in AoE. All this means that balance, I think, still is going to be an A tier spec, a very strong Mythic Plus spec. It's just not going to be as strong as it was in 9.1. And I don't really think it warrants an S tier spot, although I might be wrong on that. Destrolock and Balanced Druid are both two specs that you could consider maybe moving up to S tier. The reason why I don't, though, is that both Destro and Balanced Druid actually has some very major downsides. In Destro, you don't really have that single target damage, and for Balance, you don't really have that AoE damage, which means that I think it would be unfair to place them as an S tier spec when you consider that these three specs up here are actually doing all of those things at the same time. Next up we have the Feral Druid, and this is very interesting because historically Feral Druid has been very bad in Mythic Plus, possibly the worst spec in pretty much every single expansion so far, but this tier they actually gain a tier set, right, which shifts things up quite a bit. And the tier set for Feral does help their AoE quite a bit, which I think will actually push them up to a new tier here. Now, I still don't think they're going to be incredible. Their AoE from that tier set was recently nerfed a little bit on the PTR, dealing reduced damage beyond 8 targets, but all in all, the Feral Druid AoE has actually been substantially buffed still, all things considered, and the fact that you can also run a double legendary with the Convoke and Apex Predator legendaries combined, you're suddenly gaining some funnel damage, and your overall damage profile has actually been buffed by a substantial amount going into 9.2. All those things combined actually make Feral Druid quite a decent Mythic Plus spec in 9.2, I'd say. Nothing crazy still, you're still suffering from pretty mediocre AoE burst. Outside of that tier set 4-piece, you don't really have any consistent way of doing AoE burst, so you would have to play around that burster cooldown very well. If you want to bring a Feral Druid, I suggest doing it on maybe a tyrannical week, and then you can do some really big pulls as well. You will get all of the Feral Druid single target value, but you will also be able to put Berserk on some really big AoE pulls where you can pop off. This is similar to how you would use maybe a Destro Warlock or a Balanced Druid. Okay, time for the Shaman. And the Shaman is in a bit of an interesting spot going into 9.2 because both of the tier sets for Elemental and Enhancement don't really favor their AoE that much at first glance at least, which means that at first I wasn't really that hyped for either of the specs, but upon more investigation, I think Elemental is actually still going to be a very strong spec going into 9.2, because similar to how the Balanced Druid still fits in A tier here, I think the Elemental Shaman still brings a lot of just good stuff baseline to the dungeon, right? You have good uncapped AoE, very strong damage profile, very consistent, you have a lot of utility with the totems, with the earth elemental. Now, as I said, the tier set doesn't really play that much into their AoE, and from what I have seen so far, it seems that you might be, after actually gaining the tier set, you might be scrapping the Storm LA full AoE build, and you might be moving on to a Fire LA, more lava burst focus build, which I actually personally think is a ton of fun to play. Playing around lava burst is probably the most fun you have as an elemental shaman. So if the elemental shaman playstyle gets shifted towards fire elemental with a more single target focused build in Mythic Plus, they might become somewhat akin to a Demolock, where you don't really bring them for their uncapped AoE, but rather just for their consistent single target pressure throughout the entire dungeon. In that way, I think elemental is going to be quite a fun spec to main in 9.2, because you're going to have that AoE profile before you get the tier set, and then you're going to have a nice single target profile after you get the tier set. The double legendary is pretty decent as well, and all things considered, just looking really strong in 9.2. The same can't really be said for Enhancement, however, because Enhancement, while doing really good single target damage, suffers from some of the same issues that Beastmaster does, right? You're already really good at single target, but the tier set kind of only buffs your single target more, so in Mythic Plus viability it isn't really looking that great. However, this maybe means that you won't have as high of a reliance on your borrowed power, on your legendaries, but still Enhancement isn't really that great in the dungeons in 9.1 either, so you're not really looking at a very strong base power going into 9.2 either. All this means that Enhancement sadly goes in the D tier, but similar to the other specs I was talking about here, if you're good at Enhancement, you're obviously going to be very fine in the dungeons, you're going to do a ton of damage, you're going to smurf on some kids, so don't worry about it too much. Next up is the DK. This is a spec that I don't know too much about, so I'm not going to pretend to have some massive in-depth analysis here. I think that the DK has suffered for quite a while in Mythic Plus. It isn't really that great in terms of utility, right? You're only bringing the battle res compared to what most other classes bring. That's very mediocre. Unholy seems to be more single target focused in 9.2, with the execute damage from their tier set going really well into raids, but not really favoring them that well in Mythic Plus, I think. I can't really say if Unholy or Frost is going to be better in the dungeons. I don't play them, so I don't really know too much about their in-depth damage profile. I'm guessing that they're going to have pretty similar forms of damage and obviously the same amount of utility, so I don't think they're going to be that far apart in terms of balance. Another spec that was quite difficult for me to rate here in 9.2 actually was the Windwalker, because as we all know, the Windwalker is incredibly strong in dungeons. It has all of the damage, all of the utility necessary, and it's been a menace in the Mythic Plus format for a long time now. That said, 9.2 is actually looking a bit bad for Windwalker for once, because the tier set is not really working as intended and it's a little bit mediocre. The Necrolord ability was actually recently nerfed quite a bit, making it no longer able to crit, and although that might seem like a mediocre nerf, you've got to remember that Windwalker actually runs full verse, full crit, because you want that Boneless Brew to crit. So not only do you actually hit Boneless Brew, but you also hit their biggest stat profile right now, which might turn out to be a bigger nerf than intended. That said, the base power of the Windwalker, I think, just enough carries it to the S tier in 9.2 as well. If the Blizzard starts fixing the tier set, I think the tier set is actually going to be quite good in Mythic Plus. And although the double legendary and the Necrolord ability might have been a little bit tuned down, you're definitely going to have one of the best 5 target profiles still, one of the best AoE profiles in the game, but you might actually start losing out in damage to the Survival Hunter if the tier set ends up being good, and maybe even to the Frost Mage and to the Deathlock on uncapped AoE. So Windwalker damage looking a bit weaker than normal, but still very, very strong, and still warrants it to being an S tier spec, considering that you have Ring of Peace, you have the leg sweep, you have all of the survivability and all that stuff, so still looking like a very strong spec. Another controversial one here is the Havoc Demon Hunter. I've seen some people thinking that this is going to be incredibly broken, some people thinking it's going to be real bad. I had some high hopes going into 9.2 because I figured, hey, you would still be playing Night Fae, and it would actually be really strong in terms of consistent AoE damage, really good burst. You could play the Night Fae Lego with the Immolation Aura Lego, it would be all good. However, recent developments with the tier set is looking like you're obviously favoring a demonic build instead of a momentum build, and Venthyr starts looking very, very good. So my prediction is that you're gonna be playing Venthyr Demonic in single target and AoE, and in that case I think it's actually not the best, because your consistent profile with that Venthyr is really, really good, but outside of that you aren't really reaching any incredible highs in terms of AoE damage, in terms of AoE burst, if you compare it to the specs above it, right? Arms, Elemental, Arcane, Fury, Marksmanship, Balance, and all of the other ones, they all do incredible AoE burst, right? If they want to blow up a pack, they can definitely do it. The same isn't really true for Havoc in 9.2. You have the Venthyr ability, Sinful Brand, which you're going to have to apply and reapply a lot of times before you get that massive AoE value out of it. This all means that I think Venthyr Demon Hunter might be pretty strong in like very high keys, very high fortified weeks maybe, but all in all I think its general viability on lower keys when you're just speedrunning through the dungeon, when you're killing packs very quickly, is actually going to be pretty mediocre. And it seems like we're ending on a spicy note here, because another controversial one is the Shadow Priest. Some people say that this doesn't do any AoE damage, some people say you need to bring it for the PI, for the buffing. I personally again think it's maybe somewhere in between. I don't think it's going to be anywhere near the S tier here, but I think it might creep up into the lower parts of A, because again, the damage is actually not bad at all. Its single target is very strong. Its AoE is mediocre, sure, especially if you're not running the AoE build. But with a tier set, they're actually gaining a little bit of AoE value. And we saw a lot of times in the MDI or in higher keys, teams were actually bringing Shadow Priest as a support class that still did some really strong uncapped AoE, obviously, compared to some of the other melee specs that didn't really do uncapped. And then you still have that very strong single target value, as well as maybe PIing your Frost Mage, PIing your Survival Hunter, whatever it is, PIing your Destrolock. So I think Shadow Priest obviously has most of its value as a support class still, but can definitely hold its own with the tier set, and is looking quite damn strong in 9.2 Mythic Plus. And finally, the last spec of the tier list, the Retribution Paladin. This is again a bit of a controversial one. I think that Retribution Paladin has a really nice base kit in terms of Mythic Plus. It does a good amount of AoE damage, it has fun legendaries, fun spells, fun talents to experiment with there, but the problem is again the tier set here, and you can see a common theme among most of the specs in D and C tier. The tier set just doesn't really add that much damage on AoE here. And the same goes for Ret Paladin. Its tier set is quite possibly one of the worst in the game right now, and if that doesn't get buffed by some amount, or it gets changed, I think Ret Paladin is sadly in a pretty bad spot in 9.2, because the only thing that you would actually bring a Retribution Paladin to Mythic Plus 4 is the good AoE damage, right? So when you're looking at Survival Hunters, when you're looking at Windwalker Monks to fill in that melee spot, even potentially a Fury Warrior in there, then suddenly Retribution Paladin isn't really that appealing at all when you consider that it doesn't do a lot of damage, it doesn't really have a lot of the same utility that some of these specs have either. Okay, we have all the classes ranked here. Let's see how it looks with the tier set reliance in mind. We can see that there are quite a few outliers. We have the Survival Hunter, for example, being very dependent on the tier set. The same goes for the Destrolock and the Feral Druid. All of those classes are probably gonna hit more or less like a wet noodle at the start of 9.2, especially the Feral Druid. I think is gonna be very bad in Mythic Plus at the very start of the patch. Then on the other hand, I think Elemental Shaman, not very reliant at all on the tier set, gonna see a very nice play at the start of 9.2, I think. The same goes for Frost Mage, even though the tier set's good, I don't think it's very reliant upon the tier set at all, and you're gonna see very good results from Frost Mages at the start of 9.2. The same could to an extent be said out of maybe Fire Mages, Marksmanship Hunters, Windwalker Monks as well. But now I want to know from you guys, which specs did I massively misplace on this list, which are too high, which are too low, and otherwise, which spec are you planning to main in 9.2, guys? Leave it down in the comments down below, and subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye guys, thanks a lot.